Hello friends, this is Brian from BD's Shop, and as promised I want to give you a history of the Rickenbacker Guitar Company. And I just posted a video with a Rickenbacker 4003 stereo input bass with Rico sound. So now I want to give you the history of the Rickenbacker Company, as I've done for Fender and Gibson, and I will do for Ibanez soon. So I'm going to read from notes that I compiled because, to be honest, I started playing when I was 16, and of all the instruments and bands I played in, I never knew the history of the companies that made the instruments that we play, and it's very interesting to know how they came to be and who designed them. So let me start with this. Adolf Rickenbacker, spelled Rickenbacher, was born in Switzerland in 1887. He emigrated to the United States in 1918 and changed his name to Rickenbacker, Backer, as many of the immigrants at that time did because they wanted their last names to sound more American. He formed the Rickenbacker Manufacturing Company in 1925, which fabricated metal bodies for the national guitars being produced by the National String Company at the time. He was a skilled production engineer and a machinist. He collaborated with a shareholder in the national company named George Beauchamp, who at the time was experimenting with amplification of stringed instruments. In 1931, the two of them formed the Roe-Patton, RO/PAT/IN Corporation, which produced steel electric Hawaiian guitars with the brand name Rickenbacker. These were known as frying pans due to their long neck and circular body. They also manufactured amplifiers to go with their guitars. And interestingly, speakers for these amplifiers were designed by James B. Lansing. And you will know that name because that company, JBL, still manufactures all kinds of sound equipment, speakers, live sound, recorded sound today. And I've used many JBL speakers in PA systems in the bands I've played at in the past. It's interesting to know that many of these people who we're now learning the history of crossed paths during their careers. So in 1933, Roe-Patton changed its name to the Electro String Instrument Company, and their instruments were labeled Electro, but later changed to Rickenbacker in 1934 in honor of their primary shareholder, Adolf Rickenbacker. So next, during 1940s, Rickenbacker amps were sometimes repaired by Leo Fender and Leo Fender's Radio Repair Shop in California. And interesting, again, here are two famous people that crossed paths. Leo Fender never played an instrument, but he knew how to design instruments to fit the needs of musicians at the time. So let's jump forward to 1953, and then I'll back up into the early 50s. The Electro String Company was bought by F.C. Hall, who owned the Radiotel Corporation. And at this time, radio was being replaced by television in terms of the primary media for music at the time. He began focusing on standard electric and acoustic guitars rather than the steel guitars by Rickenbacker's original company. Well, let's talk about the 1950s. This was the birth of rock and roll. You had, prior to that, you had jazz, you had gospel, you had country, and all of these things were brought together in the form of rock and roll. So rock and roll exploded in the 1950s. Leo Fender in 1951 designed the first electric bass that went commercial, called the P-bass, or precision bass. It was called that because, unlike the stand-up basses in the past, which were fretless, this had frets on it, so you could precisely play each note without sliding between the fretless area on the guitar. So he brings out the P-bass in 1951 along with the Telecaster guitar. Then to compete, Gibson in 1953 comes out with the solid guitar, the SG bass, which was a short scale bass. And short scale means that the length of the neck to the bridge is 30 inches instead of the standard 34 of the P-bass. 1956, Hofner comes out with the violin bass, also called the Beatle bass because it was made famous by Paul McCartney using it in the Beatles. This was also a short scale bass, and it was a hollow body, so it was very light and easy to play. Skip to 1957. Finally, Rickenbacker jumps into the bass game with the 4000 series guitars. And this is, again, a solid body bass guitar with a neck through design, which is important because it gives it tremendous sustain. And then in the 60s, he came out with the 4001 series, the next iteration, and finally in 1979, they continued to produce this same guitar under the 4003 series, some of which had Rico sound, or the stereo output, which I demonstrated on the blue bass behind me. This, what's called the Blue Boy bass, they don't make it in blue anymore, so it's kind of an interesting guitar. They make it in all kinds of colors, but not this baby blue anymore. So let's talk about the 60s. Rickenbacker guitar's reputation widened as John Lennon used one during the early days of the Beatles, first seen on the Ed Sullivan Show. Later, George Harrison played a 12-string Rickenbacker, and McCartney played a Rick bass when he wasn't using his Hofner. He also played a Rick bass in his time with Wings. Well, the Rickenbacker basses have this distinctive tone because of what I mentioned, which is sustain given to it by the neck through design. They also have a slightly narrow neck, good for players with small hands like myself, and a lacquered rosewood fingerboard, which makes it really slick and easy to play. And I mentioned some of the models, but not all have this stereo output called the Rico sound. The higher end models have that, which I've got here, but I didn't pay a pretty penny for it because it was so long ago. So just as a bit of history, Chris Squire of Yes was one of the people who pioneered using the Rick sound. He routed one of the pickups to a guitar amp and the other one to a bass amp, and he got different effects in stereo. Other artists who used the Rick basses were Geddy Lee of Rush, Bill Wyman, John Entwistle of Who used it when he wasn't using his Thunderbird Gibson bass, and many others. Currently, Rickenbacker Corporation is located in Santa Ana, California, and you can buy these wonderful basses and guitars. And I hope this history gives you a little bit of appreciation for where these instruments that we all play came from. And I would encourage anyone who's thinking of picking up an instrument, pick up one. Pick up a guitar, pick up a bass, pick up a horn. Sit down at the piano, because this is skill that you can use your entire life and you will enjoy it, believe me. Again, this is Brian from BD Shop saying so long for today. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.